Hey everybody, this is Rydo, and we're back to another live stream of the Minigame Podcast. We'll do a warm-up section, then we'll jump into the video game news. Today is Monday, January 6th. I worked on my macros over the weekend, so I think I may have actually fixed it in a unique way. So the problem was that the program I use, UI Vision, of which there's not really any competition, to automate opening a ton of web pages to cover the news, just isn't getting updated to work particularly well for the one specific command of opening new tabs, which is a very important command, but not actually that important overall as far as the hundreds of lines of code that it goes through. So I was able to figure out that we could just bypass it in a certain way, because it can select windows based on their titles pretty well, pretty consistently. It just can't successfully and consistently open tabs in Firefox in the same window. Let me use the right terms here. So I can just make the home page of Firefox all of the starter windows that I need, simply by adding a bar pipe symbol after one URL as your custom home page. You can open a second one and a third one and a fourth one, and for me that's probably about a dozen starter windows that can just be consistently opened every time I open a new window. Now, inherently, that does mean if I open a new window, I'm going to have a dozen pages opening that I may not want, and I may have to just go through them and close them all. But on a day-to-day basis, that will be kind of a rarity. It also would seem like that meant that all the pages would open at the same time, and that there'd be a problem with that. I'm not. So, I think I've fixed my macro, to make a long story short. Without having to roll back to a very older version of the macro, which is not something I particularly wanted to do. Now, inherently, if UI Vision just updated its software and wasn't so buggy, that would be the real solution you would want. But yeah, looking at their forum right now, it's just flooded with spam comments. So over this Christmas holiday, it has been neglected, which is not super crazy. Like, I also saw one YouTuber I followad's channel get stolen over Christmas, and I don't think that's came back either. In that whole process, I also found an optimization that should speed up the process of waking up, of making all the pages to start with faster too, just because the curation function that I have to make sure I'm not showing any adult content Steam games would go through and repeat itself on the same page once there were no more new pages to look at. So by adding a simple if command, as far as is the old page you looked at the same as the current page you're being asked to look at, if it isn't, continue. If it is, go ahead and skip it. Type code. Should fix that fairly easily. So that should speed things up too. Over the weekend, I will say I kind of hit a wall as far as my house cleaning and curation. I made some progress certainly, but particularly on Saturday, I definitely was, particularly on Sunday, I was definitely just tired of it. You know, I've been trying to clean house for a full month now, every single day, not really taking any days off. There's been a couple days where, on particularly Saturdays, I've just kind of slept a lot, and I've been trying to take it slow, but there are clearly, for me at least, some limits to how much I can do anything, even if you're taking breaks. Yeah. And I think that's probably true for most people. and inherently that's why you have to be desperately poor and impoverished and always living paycheck to paycheck to maintain some of those jobs where you are just doing the same thing over and over again. I did certainly for a long time work a job where you would literally doing the same thing over and over again every minute or so. It was a phone style customer service style job. So yeah, I've had a lifetime of that to fill up my frustration level past the point of boiling over, I would say. I am considering in changing the SteamDB charts here just to the Steam charts. It is about the same, but the Steam charts will kind of filter things a little bit better. Plus, it would be one less website that SteamDB may disappear or go down at some point, but Steam's own charts may not. Plus, the major reason though is I really do want to at some point get to the point where I have a screensaver type function that is showing off these videos for each of the top 100 concurrent games. As far as that is my bathroom break aspiration, and perhaps even a pre-show. He's not doing anything, let's go ahead and start the screensaver thought. But yeah, I hit a frustration level. I know I'm bouncing all around here on Saturday. Played with my Steam Deck a little bit. Every time I turn on my Steam Deck, which is about once a month, yes, there is an update to SteamOS. No, there's not anything particularly too interesting there. So all I'm typically do is turn it on, see if there's an update that has any interesting change logs, and then go into desktop mode and update all the flat packs and other programs I've installed on them, or very often just refresh them. And yes, there was a bunch of updates there, but again, nothing particularly interesting there. I did play with the Godot engine on the Steam Deck, which I will say the Godot engine version 4 on a cell phone is not big enough really to make any sense that you would do anything with it. You'd almost certainly either have to plug in your cell phone to a TV and go into some kind of desktop mode, which depending on your cell phone you can do that, or some cell phones you can't. Android 16 should make that more standard over across the board. But yeah, you'd want a Bluetooth mouse and keyboard connected to it. You want a bigger screen to do Godot. Now, the fact that you could do any kind of game engine programming on a cell phone is amazing, certainly, but it just doesn't have a specialized custom portable interface. So everything is just too small. Everything is difficult to move around. And it's not particularly that much better on the Steam Deck, but that 1280 by 800 resolution on the Steam Deck screen, that 7-inch screen, is big enough to be somewhat reasonable. You're still running into some major problems though, in that you just aren't going to want to use that pop-up keyboard for long-term sessions to code. Although the Godot engine is actually amazingly good at reducing the amount of lines of code that you actually need to write compared to other non-video game specific programming engines. That being said, for the thing I was playing with, that also presents a problem, because what I want is to be able to integrate a offline speech detection function, probably using VOSK, V-O-S-K. And while there's 3 or 4 examples for doing that on different versions of the Godot engine, I cannot get a single one of them to actually work. Not on the Steam Deck and not on Android. Particularly on Android, it's going to be difficult because of just how that's all going to be integrated. It inherently making a actual C++ or C# code and adding that to the Godot engine still feels fairly difficult and fairly confused, as GD extensions is what I think they're supposed to be. But it doesn't feel like there's an easy way just to install that. And Godot very much is built around the idea of using GD scripts to do a Python-like coding that is nowhere as open and free, and it isn't just copying and pasting Python code either to integrate other libraries. So because of that, and because it's a game engine, the idea of voice recognition to make an app, or the idea to make apps in general, is very much low focus and just hasn't been done enough, which is kind of shocking, particularly in the case of Microsoft. Not so much surprising on Apple with Siri, but with Microsoft when they were pushing Cortana, it's kind of crazy that Cortana is not integrated into the Xbox infrastructure, where you could pop up Cortana and say mute the music or turn down the music and just automatically adjust menu settings that would be global to any game being played on an Xbox. Valve certainly could embrace that too, and it makes kind of a lot of sense too, to be able to, instead of trying to go through menus and figure it out, but to be able to say mute the music, turn down the music. Probably would want to have to press a button or have a key phrase, and I don't know what Valve would call their voice recognition software that they would have to almost certainly buy from somebody else. But yeah, certainly would be nice if that was the case. And SteamOS is probably a great category where there aren't that many settings to Steam anyways, where voice recognition would work very nicely. And if Cortana or some other kind of voice recognition was built into the infrastructure of games, it would become more standardized to the point where it would just be expected. That you could certainly see it popping up and being used also inside of games, where you might tell a co-op player, an AI co-op player, NPC, to pick up bullets or like cover you or something like that. Go ahead, things like that. And there are some games that have independently done that, but they're fairly few and far between. Pretty old games, most of them, probably not using the newest models and the newest technologies that exist out there. So yeah, even though I have played with the Godot engine a couple times when I really didn't have time to play with them, I still am very much stymied in that I could probably make a game, but I can't make the apps that I would like to make using the Godot engine, which is a shame because of that compatibility of potentially compiling it and having it run on Android and possibly even iOS is very appealing, certainly, as far as an engine goes. But then you also have to think of it. It is fully something you have to admit that there's just not enough compatibility for a lot of C# programmings. If you were making a Windows program, for instance, Comic Rack Community Edition now is something that it'd be really nice if that could be built in the Godot engine and thus have portable versions of it running on Android and ARM and things like that. But it also is so heavily built on the .NET C# coding API that Microsoft used to support. You really just couldn't copy and paste the code over. It just wouldn't work. It's too specialized of an engine at the moment. YouTube's been suggesting a lot of Bellatro videos to me. I've watched a couple of them, but for the life of me, I cannot figure out how that game goes. And I think that's kind of the point, is that you have to actually play it to understand it. And Bowling in there is probably the same case. So I really have gotten to the point where I just don't want to even watch any more of those videos, because I'm just spoiling myself on stuff, and I'm not even really spoiling myself because I'm not understanding what I'm seeing. Which there is something to be said about making your game somewhat understandable when somebody's looking over your shoulder, or more likely when it's being streamed, instead of being so cryptic that you'd really have to go through the tutorial yourself and play the game for a while to figure it out. Although there is something to be said about that too. I mean, the Binding of Isaac is kind of built around the idea of you have to figure out what items do as you're playing. I saw someone playing Binding of Isaac Rebirth for the first time, which was an interesting thought, to just watch somebody play the game not knowing anything. But I would say there is a difference, I think, in a mistake that can be made by playing Binding of Isaac Rebirth with Aftermath and Aftermath Plus DLC installed first, or compared to playing the game, the flat game experience to start with. That maybe there's just a little bit too much balancing and too many new items and too many new characters, even from a fresh brand new game in Rebirth. There might even be an argument to going back and playing the original Binding of Isaac, just to kind of have a smaller subset of items to unlock and focus on. Although I don't think you really need to do that. I think you could start with Rebirth and just have none of the DLC installed and then buy the DLC. Whereas nowadays, if you're going to buy the DLC, you tend to buy it all, which means it tends to be installed. So perhaps in the case of Binding of Isaac, it might be wise for them to put a pop-up and say, don't enable the DLC until after the first dozen runs or so. It's not 100% different, but it is slightly different. It felt like just slightly more characters and more layouts. I don't know if I have anything else to really say as far as a warm-up section, since, yeah, there is a possibility that either today or tomorrow I might get stuck in a winter storm, and as such power might go out and I might not stream, so I'll warn about that. But at the moment everything seems fine. When I was playing with the Steam Deck, the prompt popped up when I went to desktop mode whether I wanted to submit my hardware for the Steam hardware and software survey, which I said okay, go ahead and do that. It is also worth pointing out as a side note that Linus Tech Tips showed that it is somewhat possible to install the recovery image of SteamOS and the Steam Deck to non-Steam Deck computers. That being said, I just don't think, unless that becomes recommended by Valve themselves, the way to go. I think you are just better off installing Bazzite Linux at the moment if you have to install a SteamOS like experience. Now, it may be the case that in a matter of days that changes and a new version of SteamOS does come out with a new installer that is going to be more targeted to saying, here's an installer that will install on any kind of pre-built computer or any kind of custom built computer, with the limitations that we're going to blacklist a few types of hardware. I still think SteamOS probably can't come out with a new version that says we've got NVIDIA graphics cards, which are 75.43% of the graphic cards being used still on Steam for December. So I could see them kind of blocking NVIDIA graphics cards, which would eliminate a significant portion, obviously, of pre-built and custom computers with the installer. And that's kind of the main thing, is just NVIDIA GPUs are the real issue. You can see that 7.72% are using Intel graphics cards, which only the newest Intel graphics card is something you'd really consider using for gaming. And then 15.52% using AMD graphics cards, which is still a very small number. Now CPU, it definitely was a case. Do we even have, here's the CPU. Definitely was a case that in the old days, for many years, an Intel CPU, which is 62.30% of December, and an NVIDIA GPU was the way to go. But that's all based on operating systems of Windows, which the whole goal here is to inherently get away from Windows. And we can see that actually 1.98% of Windows 11 users went up. And the reason why we're using Windows is because of DirectX 10, 11, and 12, which we can see that I'm not sure how much the Steam Deck's compatibility layers may mess with the Steam hardware survey. It probably doesn't mess with it at all. So this vast majority here is DirectX 12 GPUs and Windows 10, with other options being DirectX 11, Vista Plus, or DirectX 10, 11, 12, and XP all combined, or DirectX 12 and pre-Windows 10, or DirectX 10 and Vista. So I guess I would be, on my current computer, probably DirectX 12 and Windows 10 is probably what I would fall under, unless I'm in some weird other category. Yeah, DirectX 12 and Windows 10, which I guess is where I am at. I thought Windows 10 stopped at DirectX 11. The number of CPUs per computer is still in this weird other category at the majority. Let's see. The other category is above 8 GPUs. This blue sliver is 8. This is 6. Is 4. Interesting. And yeah, I don't think this chart is showing things particularly well. The even split here certainly, I think, also highlights an issue that there's a lot of people that don't have gaming computers that are gaming on Steam. A lot of home users that have laptops that are really not designed for gaming, or a lot of office users that have computers that are not designed for gaming. And as such, there's, I think, a lot of older components and computers being used. Plus, there may just be a lot of people around the world that also run into that issue of having underpowered computers but want to play games and still playing something on Steam, or at the very least have Steam installed. So I'm thinking I'll go over these charts in detail once per month starting this year with the Steam hardware charts, but we'll show it once every live stream very quickly. So more metrics. Personally, 8 CPUs, 16 cores does feel to me like the minimum from a gaming computer, and if you're going to stream or something, you should probably go up to probably at that point 12 CPU cores, 24 threads, just to have a little overhead. But it is a weird situation where, yeah, I wouldn't want to go lower than 8. That being said, I think most games probably barely use 4 cores, even being maxed out. That they're just not really optimized even today to go higher than that. And parallel processing on different cores or different threads is really just not something that's particularly optimized. And I can see why even the game engines themselves would struggle to figure out ways to parallel process things automatically. Yeah. There's not any easy way of doing that. And then as far as the Macintosh hardware ownership, we can see that it is MacBook Air. I think that is the biggest number. Maybe MacBook Pro is the biggest number for gaming. MacBook Air being the second one. And then Mac Minis and iMacs and Mac Pros and all of that. These charts are bad. Really, very hard to read. I don't even care about VR headsets. That does seem fairly balanced all over the point. Yeah. Why do these colors not even match? Yeah, this blackness to me implies that there's just fewer and fewer people overall actually using Mac. And I think that is the case. Is that the amount of people actually using a Mac product has significantly declined overall. Whereas all these other charts aren't really implying something like that at all. But yeah, this black does not match any color. And then I guess this is just your most popular setup, which might show you something as far as just what to build if you're going to build a computer. It's something with Windows 11, as much as you may hate it, 16 gigabytes of RAM, Intel CPU speeds are that's probably supposed to be internal CPU speeds, because there's not an AMD CPU speed comparison here. 2.3 gigahertz to 2.69. Honestly, that seems really low. 6 CPUs seems off. I would rather 8 CPUs and much faster. 8 gigabytes of VRAM seems low. I would say go 12. 1080p still makes a lot of sense in my case. And then triple monitor seems to be the case. Although this isn't triple monitor, this is actually just double monitor once I actually do the math. So if you have multiple monitors, on average you have 2 monitors. I think triple and quadruple monitors make a lot of sense if you can afford it. 100 gigabytes to 250 gigabytes is kind of the minimal 250, I would say. And then over a terabyte of spinning hard drive space is still something that makes a lot of sense. I don't even know what LAHF and SAHF even is. Seems to be some kind of CPU code, because that's what the rest of these are, is specific CPUs to have like SSE3 and hyper-threading. Each one of these can be clicked on for more information. Chinese is the second biggest language. as far as people using Steam, although that is a very different Steam, with Russian being the third language, Spanish Spain being the fourth. So yeah, definitely a lot of places here, that a lot of languages that aren't being implemented very often. 3080 graphics card with your section option being a 4060. No, that's actually a 3060 versus a 4060. I don't think you should get a 60 at all, even a TI. Should be getting probably a 4080 if you're going to get an NVIDIA card with the 5000 series just around the corner. An AMD Radeon graphics here. Seems to not be labeled particularly well. Seems like there are certainly a few people that have even gone up in tests to have 24 CPUs. Which that seems like that is a lot. Yeah, I would definitely put you closer to the 3.3 to 3.69 gigahertz CPU as far as a recommendation. And yeah, if you like to open a bunch of tabs and multitask a lot, 32 gigabytes of RAM is not crazy. Even 64 is not that crazy. Whereas you're going to run into day-to-day problems at less than 4 gigabytes. And frankly, even less than 16 gigabytes. Because Windows, in particular, is just going to be a power hog. You can see that Arch Linux, as far as the Linux, is the highest of the Linux, with that being Steam Deck included. But it is very much still only 2.29% of, in compared to everything else. It is beating Mac OS, but it's still getting trounced by Windows. If you click for more data, it takes you to a different page. So yeah, I'm still learning as far as how the Steam hardware survey goes and how often and how much detail I really need to go into it, but it is something that I think, particularly for PC gaming and for in part Linux gaming and Steam Deck gaming, something we should start keeping an eye on, because it's a different story certainly if this time next year the amount of hardware that's being used is exactly the same versus the amount of hardware that's being used has gone up in quality quite a bit, which there is a decent argument it will be exactly the same this time next year, particularly with tariffs in the United States. That but CES is happening right now basically, so all kinds of new announcements could be happening, which may not mean that anything actually gets released by this time next year, but who knows. Around that, I do think I saw a story that we'll get into as far as not to expect a new Steam Deck using a certain new technology to be announced. But yeah, they may have actually painted themselves kind of in a corner where they said they were looking for a generational change, and now there might actually be a generational change announcement in one piece of hardware in the Steam Deck, and Valve may still not be ready to actually release a new Steam Deck, if they're going to release a new Steam Deck at all. At a certain level, again, if they just focused on the operating system, the value may very much be going forward around fixing SteamOS to run on more hardware than to release another piece of hardware, because the Steam Deck itself is kind of fine as it is. We'll see what the next Nintendo Switch does, if it adds any new ideas, or if any other devices add any new ideas. But the only piece of hardware that I think would be interesting is if you can figure out a way to take a PlayStation or Xbox controller and make it much flatter and much more pocketable. If you could figure out a way to make the analog joysticks flip downward, and flatten themselves so they're not tall, or if you could figure out a way to get rid of analog joysticks and make something that feels like an analog joystick but takes up a lot less vertical height, that would be revolutionary, because then you can have these two Joy-Con-like devices that would just connect to each other and be flat enough to stick in a pocket and carry with you at all time. Whereas right now, two Joy-Cons in your pocket is not really realistic. You can maybe get a Joy-Con in each pocket, but then you'd get a lot of stick drift as you broke the sticks in your pocket. Flat thumbsticks instead of tall thumbsticks are not appreciated. There is something to the throw of the current height of joysticks and controllers that people like, and I don't know how you really replace that. But yeah, you certainly can't put an Xbox controller in your pocket and carry it day to day. You can't put a PlayStation controller in your pocket and carry it day to day. So maybe there's an aspect of maybe it doesn't even need to be pocketable. Maybe if you just had something that wrapped around your wrist like a bracelet and went around in several spirals, and then put controllers and buttons right under your hand, maybe there would be something to that. But the gauntlet thought would probably be fairly heavy. Most people barely want to wear watches. We've never seen any technology as far as gauntlets work. And at some point, I guess if we get brain control interfaces, then you wouldn't need a controller in the first place, but that's kind of sci-fi still at this point. But that's where I think the revolution of controllers could really go. Do I think Valve can solve that challenge? Not really. I think Valve's touchpads are nice and all, and certainly maybe they could make a flatter device that just had touchpads and didn't have any analog sticks on them, but I don't think people would really love that as a concept. It's certainly something they might experiment with. Two Joy-Con-like devices with Valve touchpads on them and triggers on them in the back, and that's it. That would be the one way to make it flatter. We can see on my chart, it's still pretty much the same as far as what are the most relevant games so far. I could certainly restart the metrics for just this year. There is an argument to possibly doing that. I don't know if I can make the charts dynamic though, whether it would be like a checkbox in Google Sheets. I don't think you can. It'd be interesting, certainly, if you could click a button and just show from the beginning of this year, which would really only be a couple of sample days. As far as Steam is concerned, as far as the front page is concerned, there's not going to be anything at the moment, and frankly it will be, I think, a while before we see another sale. Spring potentially would be the next big sale, and even then spring sales are not the big sales. Summer is the big sale. I did watch a couple of these videos from one YouTuber where he got a whole bunch of game developers, I believe using Unity in this case, together, and they would do these kind of game jam like pass it on challenges without communicating to each other. So one person would work on it for a little bit, maybe a few days, maybe a few hours. I'm not really sure they consistently said how long each person worked on it, and then they would just hand the code over to the next programmer who would work on it. And it certainly highlighted a problem of feature creep, as each programmer certainly wanted to just put their own mark on the game, and the game just got more and more features and more stuff that it really didn't need, particularly in the 100 version of the video series. There's several series where it's fewer people, but it also just kind of highlights that it's turning me around on my dislike for game directors a little bit, and that there almost certainly needs to be somebody in charge to keep programmers from going off on wild tangents. Because if the 100 programmers I followed and that they chose, that I watched, I'm surprised more people haven't really been making footage or talking about Indiana Jones. But yeah, if the 100 programmers are an average example of programmers, they have bad taste. There really is just no better way of saying it. They have dumb ideas that don't lead to good games. They lead to kind of ridiculous meme games, which probably does mean they are average, considering how many ridiculous garbage meme games get released on Steam day to day. And that overall is my complaint about the series, is that each of these developers have already, or almost all of them, have already put a game out on Steam, and they highlight their games, and all of them look like low effort asset flip garbage games. None of them feel particularly unique or great, at least in the way that they show brief highlights on it. So, to use an example and give a little bit more details, the 100 game developers start off with one programmer wanting to make a Quake-like Magic Battle Arena game where you're running around in an arena shooting magic from your hands and wizards. And by the end of the game, they had made a level in which it is totally dedicated to all the programmers just highlighting their cats and dogs, called the Hall of Heroes. They've added a toilet as, just for no reason, just a floating in the sky toilet, and which gets integrated into the main story, which then leads to an entire poop theme where the player can poop and pick up poop and throw poop, which, yeah, it just gets childish. At one point, somebody then takes out the poop and adds a pee function, and these are people that knew they were short on time, so they put their focus on doing things that would not have the game look like a professional game. They went all over the place as far as the visuals. One person would take it one way, another would do it that way. Between the 100 developers, they tended to change and undo and break the previous person's code quite a bit. So certainly nobody on the same page. And I guess that is really where a director would be useful, and those weekly meetings or daily meetings to be on the same page would be useful certainly too. I guess inherently, when you really are working with a team, probably are assigned a section that is yours and yours alone to have ownership on, and you don't have a case where 100% of the code is being touched by 100% of the different developers. All of the developers, I think, are probably programmers more than they're animators, although some of them did certainly add some animations. But yeah, none of them are particularly organized enough to stick to an organization system. And so the final product is very lackluster, not really ambitious, not well polished, and yeah, I don't know what you really learn from a aspect like that, which arguably I think that is a question to ask as far as game jams in general. What do those programmers really learn as far as game jams go, where they're only working for a couple of days with possibly friends, possibly random strangers? You might be sharing concepts and ideas and even sharing code between other people that go to the game jam, and so there might be a little bit of learning there, but I think a lot of it is just networking and being silly. A lot of it feels like if you're a barista as your job, going home and then making yourself a cup of coffee. It just doesn't feel like something that people should want to do. Although inherently, as far as gameplay programmers go, there is an argument that maybe you would be working on your own personal projects at home as a video game programmer while working at a bigger company otherwise for a AAA type game. But yeah, it makes a lot more sense to not work in the game industry at all if you're going to do that, and then work on your passion project at home and be a programmer for, say, a accounting firm, accounting software type company, get paid a lot more and work less hours. But yeah, I probably will watch more of those videos, but I'm just not very enthusiastic around the final product there, where that feels like the video should have had an amazing final product. There is basically only one exception to the rule, I would say, in that you have The Binding of Isaac, the original version of The Binding of Isaac, being programmed by 2 people and it coming out very good. Whereas I think the vast majority of other individual programmers that don't have a publisher and probably a game director around don't make particularly great games, because I just don't think people who are good at programming games also are people with the good ideas or the consistency to those good ideas. And very much it has been a case where the few indie games that are worth mentioning are extremely weird and just not something you would expect to succeed. Which there is this case, certainly, in that the expectation as far as successful games is something like Call of Duty or Spider-Man, something proven, something that would be long and linear and have narrative, whereas the small-time successful games are very weird things like Belartro or Brotato, or even Hades. And Hades is perhaps a bit of an exception in that it has a bigger team and a lot of polish to it. Even the AAA games that do have a lot of polish and narrative to them often have weirder storylines. There is clearly a level of boredom around more normal life stories. If movies were as weird as video games are, it would probably be better for movies in general if that was the case. But yeah, it is kind of crazy that there never was a Diablo movie, for instance. You could easily take the events of Diablo and have made a fantasy movie around that a long time ago. Wanted to pop in here and just see. I do believe I saw in Slick Deals that there had been a refill of the stock. It seems like the refurbished stock has once again run out, though. So, yeah. And I think the prices here are still the same as far as the last time I looked. So it does feel like they are refilling and running out of refurbished stock fairly quickly on the Steam Deck. But yeah. Also CS that's happening, and I still just don't expect there to be any new announcements. As far as Video Games Chronicles go, I don't think the macro ran perfectly this time, perhaps because I ran it on Saturday as a test thing. So I manually went back and opened up all the stories we have. We're still at the new year. I mean, this is really the first official business week for 2025. So news right now for video games is still going to be somewhat lackluster, but CES news will probably pop up and speed things up a little bit for next stream. But then we also are in January, and unless things are just going to be drastically different, January, February, even April, that first quarter of the year tends to be an incredibly dry point. Now is the time to go back and play even older games, play all the games you got for Christmas, and perhaps just do non-gaming things if you must. Even if a new Switch does get announced, I don't know if it's going to be available now. Plus, I don't know, even if this new Switch did come out right now, if there would be more than one or two launch titles. So, yep, now is the time to just enjoy your older games. It'd be interesting to see if there was any big build up, and we'll, I guess, see that in January as far as people getting new computers. I don't know how many people really are afraid of the tariffs in the United States to the point where they would have bought computers or laptops or even consoles, or just electronics in general, or video games. Like the software side in particular will be hit a little bit less, but yeah. If we see the January hardware survey and there's just a massive increase of people getting PCs, I still think PC gaming is the way to go in the future. Although you certainly could get the Steam Deck and call that a PC, and at some point, if a Steam machine comes out that is more powerful, that might be the way to go for most people. Particularly in my case, I think if a Steam machine was more powerful, if a Steam machine was available and it was more powerful, that would have worked a lot better for me than having a Steam Deck, because I'm not really going outside, so I don't really need that battery. I really don't need that portability anyways. Of course, that's where SteamOS is going to have to become much more robust, is that it's going to have to start to not just target lower battery powered devices. It's going to have to start targeting very powerful, potentially, Steam machines and custom PCs also, hopefully. Elden Ring Night Rain is removing one of the Soul's best loved features. One of the Soul series' most iconic features is missing in Elden Ring Night Rain. What is the feature? They won't be able to leave messages for players or read those left by other players. The reason we remove the message feature is that in this game, which each session is about 40 minutes long, there's no time to write your own message and no time to read messages written by others. So are you limited to 40 minutes per session, or are they just saying on average it's So yeah, can't leave messages. There's another story that I am just reminded of that I wanted to mention from one of my news sources that occasionally, on very rare occasions, has something. Zur Lane on Google in particular had some lewd skins that they had released. The 5 skins in particular from the Visions of Fantasy label have been censored / removed from the game due to Google Play censorship. So censorship happens. Now I'm looking at the skins and I'll just describe one of them. It is a adult, fairly big-breasted anime lady in a bunny ears wearing a leggings and one-piece style of negligee nightwear, showing a decent amount of skin and kind of contorting on a poker table in a weird way. But she is laying in such a way that she's actually upside down, so at the top of the screen are her knees bent upward, and at the bottom of the screen is her head. So you're really not seeing too much in that image. And as far as I can tell, that is kind of all of it. So it's just kind of negligee stuff. When you run it to the comparison of a 2-piece bikini, you're seeing considerably less skin. Perhaps the poses are different, but yeah. It's not something in my mind that is so extreme that it needs to be completely removed from Google Play, but it does certainly show that there is a heavy amount of censorship on Google Play in particular. Now, maybe it should be in an adult section or some age verification. Sure, you can make that argument. Of course, Pornhub has now pulled out of pretty much the entire south of the United States due to age verification laws being something that is too much for them to bother with, apparently. Which is probably true. The laws probably are written in such a way that it's just too dangerous and too much work, and it is just easier for them to block entire states instead. But yeah, age gates have been around for a long time, and having to have real world IDs, which is what the age verification laws are in most of these states in the United States, is asking quite a bit. I don't know what the real solution there is, though. There could be perhaps a super cookie type ISP thing where the ISP gives you a code to an adult who is paying a bill, so the ISP knows your ID and knows the adults are paying it, and then the code is then on the parents or the adult to maintain and keep that for themselves. There could be a rolling code every billing cycle, certainly, where that would be fairly a good way to do it. In fact, it's surprising that there isn't actually a system there. There would be some levels of security in bypassing it, certainly, but it probably would be more difficult than just using a VPN to go to a different state or a different country. But yeah, the main concern here is you don't want to have to give personal identifiable information to random porn sites that are potentially going to get hacked or use that information in some kind of blackmailable way. Although, even if you did have a code, having the ISP being the intermediary still probably could connect one person to the other. But yeah, ISP already has your personal information, so it's not a big deal there. You could also avoid that completely by just having two kinds of internets, which that also already exists, where most people who have the internets from ISPs have it completely uncensored, where there are options from ISPs to have a censored internet. So yeah, but yeah, the laws are being written in particular to just hurt porn, which that doesn't directly have anything to do with video games, but it does certainly speak to the sentiment that there a lot of people in power that are going after adult content of any kind, to some kind of crazy puritanical end in which they want, I guess, a bunch of horny men and women to procreate more and then have more babies. I do think that there probably is a thought amongst crazy, extremely rich people that if they can just create enough children and enough workers out there, then they can pay them less and just have this kingdom fiefdom society created where there's a huge amount of extremely poor, extremely low paid kids running around in a generation or two. But it's not really going to work that way in the first place. It's immediately been shown it won't work that way, plus that they're implying that they can become revolution proof in that case, and that just won't be the situation. But yeah, I'm not talking about games enough here. I'm going off on too much of a tangent, so let's move on. The Naughty Dog founder explains why he sold to Sony. Looking back, it was the right call. Naughty Dog's co-founder reflects on why changes in the industry forced the studio to sell to Sony. Inherently in the headline here, you just have somebody agreeing with themselves, which, it's probably not that informative. You can generally assume that that somebody who did something is going to double down and agree with themselves. Very few people have the ability to be introspective and conflict with previous decisions, because your brains are designed to solidify once you made a decision and lock down on that decision, regardless of how bad of a decision it is, which inherently is a big issue, certainly when you make the wrong decisions or when a better option is presented to you. So even ignoring the headline there, let's take a step back and think, was Naughty Dog selling to Sony a good thing for gamers and the community in general and society in general? And on that question, the answer is obviously no, because all I have to do is look at the pictures here from games from Naughty Dog and say there hasn't been a good Banjo-Kazooie game since it's been sold to Sony. Not really. And Banjo-Kazooie is in the worst spot. There hasn't been, I think, any Jak and Daxter game, which is what I think this game is. There hasn't been a better Uncharted game. Plus Uncharted in particular, completely in its latest release, trying to unfocus away from Nathan Drake to a completely different set of people. And The Last of Us has been changed into a very different story than what it started with. Like, this girl here is now kind of hated by gamers, where she was supposed to be a sympathetic character. This guy kind of hated by gamers when he was supposed to be a character that you related to and liked. And the whole narrative, because of The Last of Us 2, and the remasters not helping things as far as the visuals go. So yeah, I don't think it was better for gamers, certainly, to sell to Sony. Sony hasn't funded the development of a lot of new games from Naughty Dog. If anything, I imagine a lot of Naughty Dog employees have been laid off. We're talking 20 years ago. So maybe he sold to Sony, and Sony did some good stuff before then, but Sony isn't doing things now that are good with Naughty Dog. And so yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at that. Like, we could go into more details of his thought process, and he could talk about numbers and money and funding quite a bit, which is what it seems like he is talking about. But inherently, somebody at the top in the position to be able to sell a company is selling a company for money, and so he's going to just be happy no matter what getting the money, unless you actually take ownership of the company and actually care about the company and want to protect the employees and protect the concept and the creations of that company, which clearly he didn't care that much about it. I personally, having not really played any of these games, just as a gamer following gamer news, would have loved to see a alternate path taken for Last of Us and Uncharted and these two games too. It is definitely a case that Banjo-Kazooie should have been something they experimented a lot more with. Jak and Daxter, I think, same case too. But for Uncharted to be basically shelved to make Last of Us, and then for Last of Us 1 to be completely changed into a completely different narrative for Last of Us 2, it is just abandoning old properties. Yeah. At the very least, with Last of Us, I would have wanted to see Last of Us 2 be only a couple of years after the events. Maybe really just a couple of hours after the events of the first game. The long time jump there, I think, is a problem there. And I definitely would have wanted to see more Uncharted games. However you do it, just make Nathan Drake like Indiana Jones and don't have the stories particularly even connect. Moving on, Final Fantasy veterans have debuted a new theme at a wrestling event. Video game fan Omega will debut new music at this weekend's Wrestle Destiny event. Interesting. Well, it's not super uncommon for a certain level of game developer to be in the wrestling. It's not super uncommon for people to be in wrestling. And I suppose New Japan Pro Wrestling is a different thing right now than WWE is, in the sense that it might actually be tolerable to enjoy and watch. AEW wrestler Kenny Omega has debuted a new theme song for Final Fantasy 14 and 16's composer. Interesting. Also, wouldn't be the first time that video game music and video games have just been advertised through wrestling. I doubt this will become the trend, because I imagine that most publishers and developers and CEOs look down on wrestling quite a bit. And honestly, I don't know how much of an audience really in New Japan Pro Wrestling or AEW Wrestling, which I think are owned by the same company. I don't know how much of an audience they have or how important that they are. But yeah, it's a little surprising that we don't see more of this, though, as far as And we probably will just generally see more of this as people are desperate to advertise anywhere that will catch people's attention. Plus, people are desperate to get advertising revenue. So I wouldn't be surprised if AEW and New Japan Pro Wrestling are getting paid a little bit less than usual to advertise on their wrestling events. But yeah, personally as a gamer, I would never, and I don't think there ever would have been a point where I would have tuned in to any kind of wrestling event to get some kind of teaser and news announcement. We already have the Game Awards for all the teasers and announcements, and most of the teasings and announcements are incredibly pointless and time wasting anyways. Wrestlers in general do tend to play a decent amount of video games as they're constantly on the road anyways, as they have the connection of having wrestling games built around them, or at least one annualized wrestling game built around them. So they may have a certain level of fandom there that they're willing to come out and admit, whereas other sports figures don't admit it as much. And yeah, I don't know if there's really too much of a connection there. Almost certainly it may just be Vince McMahon and WWE's long history of trying to advertise and doing a better job of getting advertising partners with video games, whereas places like the NFL may have done a worse job of that, or they may just be getting more money from other sources for other kinds of advertisements. Moving on, the Mass Effect 5 boss says wait and see if a major feature will return. The next Mass Effect could bring back the original trilogy's morality system. Now this is a terrible headline, frankly, and a terrible thing to say, because on the design doc, you either know whether the game is going to have a morality system or not. And if there is something that you've created that is like the original morality system but slightly different, even then you should know. Which this tells me that almost certainly you should take that they won't have a morality system and he's just being a coward and not saying no, it won't have that, or that the development is so in flux that he is pushing the publisher to fund the development of a morality system or greenlight a morality system, which at certain points he should just be professional and not respond. You'd be way better if to just not responded. It makes me feel like Mass Effect 5 is not even really in pre-production, or it's just barely in pre-production. There is definitely, I guess, an argument to not have a morality system in how terrible that whole morality and how all the morality system kind of really just led to nothing in that final ending of Mass Effect 3. And what happened to Mass Effect 4? Was it a Mass Effect 4? Or are they calling Andromeda Mass Effect 4 now? I'm really confused here. Did they release a Mass Effect 4 and it just flopped horribly? I'm gonna have to just do some research here. Because why are we talking about Mass Effect 5 if there's just been 1 and 3? Let's go to Wikipedia. the fourth game, Mass Effect Andromeda. Yeah. So yeah, they are considering Andromeda, even though it's not numbered, to be the fourth game in the series, and they are calling this new game in development Mass Effect 5, which I would half expect them to say no to that and just call it Mass Effect 4. Although inherently they may just be avoiding number 4 for Asian reasons, and that they hate the number 4 and don't name anything number 4. Well, that's kind of it. So yeah, weird. I wouldn't have really expected them to just jump and call it Mass Effect 5. Although Andromeda was such a flop, it also doesn't make a lot of sense to have another side game. But also, Andromeda is set in a completely different universe, whereas there is an expectation that, well, not a completely different universe, but a completely different part of the galaxy, distant, very distant from the rest of the characters and events of Mass Effect 1 through 3, where one assumes that you're going to go back to the Earth region of Mass Effect in Mass Effect 5. One would assume that's the case. That might also paint you in a bit of a corner, in that Mass Effect 5 may not be able to introduce too many new species of aliens, which maybe people will okay with that, maybe they aren't. Overall, regardless of the game, a wait and see answer is just kind of crazy. Yeah, you have this person here who, I'm not getting any pop-up, that posted this image saying the Renegade Paragon system is absolutely returning for Mass Effect 5. I did watch a video where it talked about how the vast majority of players play as the good guy, and that there is almost this copium level of acceptance in game developers that they are making bad guy paths simply as an option to not be taken, and that means the bad guy path is a success, even though small percentage of players actually take it. Whereas they use like Fallout New Vegas in particular as an example of that, and the whole bad guy path of being a slaver and working for Caesar in Fallout New Vegas seems really ridiculous as far as an option that could have easily been left on the cutting room floor, and still would have left you with a clearer gray ground as far as a bad guy path that is somewhat believable. Some players might play it, whereas, I don't know, being a sexist slaver working for Caesar does not in any way appeal to me as a player. And in most cases, being a bad guy doesn't appeal. If you are going to make a game where you play as a bad guy, it almost has to be like GTA, where you are the bad guy and that is the only option, and you know that going in, which that's fine. And a lot of people will bend over backwards where you're like an undercover cop, so you're doing bad things, but it's still an issue. Seems like what he did is he shot his mouth off commenting on something, when really I think these developers should go almost completely quiet. And so the response here, as I was talking about the trilogy, you'll just have to wait and see, is perhaps a more flippant but more reasonable response to a response. But yeah, what I'm learning from this headline is you should really just make directors, bosses, CEOs go quiet. Have all of that go through a PR department. If you are going to post or tweet anything, and inherently that kind of level of open communication should just not be for those kinds of people, because it causes confusion, controversy, and headlines that people just don't want, really. I don't know if you should really apply that to the low-level employees, but it's not a bad idea. If I was running a business, it's not the terriblest idea to say, I want you to go completely silent on all of these, on every single social media site you have, with the exception of when it comes to speaking about what you're working on or the job in any way. Yeah, maybe you don't go as crazy as tracking, in which there's definitely some secretaries whose entire job has become just following other people on Twitter that work there, and trying to fire people. But yeah, you should. I think there's a balance there. We can say, we just don't want you to talk on social media. Just get off social media. We want you to focus on the job. We want you to have a good work-life balance, and particularly in publicly released products like video games, that you're just going to get followed and stalked and hounded by rabid fans more than it's worth. Now the good news is Facebook and Twitter are dying, so most social media is dead already, but not so much for Twitter with game developers and things like that. Yeah. And in that, wrapping up this ramble, it is worth pointing out, I don't think too many tweets have ever been actually good or helpful for a game. Even the lollipop chainsaw repop tweets that were just kind of constantly reinforcing the game won't be censored, the game won't be censored, even though the game did lose the music rights in the long run and was somewhat changed, although I don't think you'd inherently call it censored as much as just changed. But even those tweets from the original creator, who really didn't even have anything to do with lollipop chainsaw repop, those comments didn't really help anything. They probably didn't sell one extra copy of the game or build enough hype. It's much better to just have press releases go out instead, and official accounts on Twitter to make announcements when they really have announcements to be made. Let's see. Images of alleged Joy-Con Switch 2 Joy-Cons have appeared online. If authentic, they could be the first proper look at the Switch 2 controllers. Which, okay. There is still very much a thought that this extra trigger here is simply to... Can we actually make a picture pop up? Or have I messed up the page too much? I think I've messed up the page too much for that to work. Well, just zoom in. So there's a thought that this button here is literally just releasing the magnetic controllers. I would assume this here is a magnet and that this here is a magnet. And as far as the actual buttons, it doesn't seem to me like there's any new actual buttons happening here. I'm not sure exactly what this is, whether this is a connector that locks in this connecting port, which is different, or if this is possibly some kind of infrared positional information. Now, this on this side, I believe, is the original Joy-Cons in comparison. They just slide in. So the 1, 2, 3 dots which doesn't seem to me like you've got those dots anymore to tell you which one is connected. No trigger here, but a button. Not sure what that really does as far as that button there. You can see that they are thicker slightly, although perhaps not as thick as you might want for adult hands, and they are taller slightly, if that is a true Joy-Con 2. DF Retro also covered some motherboard leak images of the Switch 2 and talked about some of the chips, and there is a potential that they speculated there that the Switch 2 is going to have a fairly small battery, and to achieve any decent amount of gameplay on that fairly small battery, it's likely that it's going to have a fairly underpowered CPU and other components built into it, targeting 10 watts per hour as far as the maximum amount of wattage it can use. So yeah, there is a real expectation, I think, by most people that a Switch 2 is going to be more powerful than the extremely underpowered Switch 1, but only by a little bit. You definitely aren't going to be getting a 2025 level piece of hardware compared to any other kind of computer components. Yeah. So it really is going to come down to the games for the Switch 2, and if perhaps Switch 2 games are exclusive to the Switch 2, as far as whether you really even need to buy one. There is also a potential thought when looking at the motherboard that the Switch 2 would either, for its own game cartridges or for memory expansion, support SD Express, which uses a PCI Express bus and extra pins compared to your standard micro SD card or SD card slot, to achieve much higher speeds. But yeah, I'd almost assume that that would be internal expansion to install components and install things from the eShops, though, because I think you probably could get even faster speeds using cartridges, using other technologies that aren't based on the SD card standard, which, yeah, people embracing the newest standards like SD Express has been very slow and lackluster. There's just not been a lot of demand for it, or adoption of it. Yeah. It is, I guess, kind of crazy that we haven't seen micro SD cards or Nintendo cartridge-like devices that would plug into a UHD 4K 8K player. Just ROM chips that you could write once. That still probably would be a lot more expensive than making a Blu-ray player that plays discs. Although we may just hit a point where it becomes impossible for manufacturers to get Blu-ray players, so we might see a point where 4K UHD players just stop getting manufactured by anybody, so instead of that you are stuck with either streaming or buying some kind of ROM chip that plugs in. It wouldn't be the worst idea if you could just have a whole bundle of movies in one little pocketbook. But yeah, that's almost something that would have to be pushed forward by somebody like Walmart, where they just don't want to get rid of movie sales. But if they're selling movies for like $5 or $10 or even $15, and then the price per disc to actually manufacture it goes up from a penny or two to 50 cents, that's just going to be a massive increase in cost that most manufacturers won't be willing to do. Moving on, I guess Marcus Notch claims he's working on a spiritual successor to Minecraft, so Minecraft 2 has basically been announced. This does show an interesting level of just how many years has it taken Notch to come out of his self-enforced retirement. He sold Mojang to Microsoft in 2014, which arguably the numbers line up so roundly that I wouldn't be surprised if he sold Mojang with a non-compete clause for 10 years, although I think contracts over 7 years are not legal in most cases. Now, I think it's the other way around, that if anything is going to take over 7 years, you have to get it in the written contract form, because certainly 30-year mortgages exist, and those are contracts that are over 10 years. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a 10-year non-compete where maybe Mojang, Notch specifically, not Mojang, because there was a separation there, and Microsoft has done very little with Mojang in 10 years. They've just been very hands-off and let them add new features fairly consistently. But I wouldn't say Minecraft is particularly too different from where it was in 2014. It's got a lot of new elements and components, but it's still mining and crafting. So yeah, I would heavily suspect there was a 10-year non-compete clause. When Notch sold it for $2.5 billion, he's probably been living a pretty good life on $2.5 billion and worth of money, and now 10 years later, I wouldn't be surprised if he just starts working solely, which is what he said he wanted to do, is just make a small project like how he originally created Minecraft by himself. But I also wouldn't be surprised if there is a case here where I wouldn't be surprised if he starts hiring up and makes a new Mojang. You can see the full tweet here. I basically announced Minecraft 2. I thought maybe people actually do want me to make another game that's super similar to the first one, and I'm loving working on games again. Which, interesting 10-year break between making games and not making games. This guy's wearing Minnie Mouse ears. I don't super duper care exactly which game I make first, or even if I make more, but I do know. Show more. Let's see if that will actually show more. I do know I'm making one, so I figured I'd absolutely be willing to give it an honest shot in the form of a spiritual successor to Minecraft and put a poll about it. My intentions are clear and honest about it, saying that the spiritual successors are usually kind of, washed up tragic things I'm fearing my next game is going to be anyway, and try to push myself to avoid. So why not do the thing that people do want and are willing to give me somehow even more cash for, and intend for the money to be spent for good. Oh my god, have I learned I fail a lot. Winning is failing until you make yourself succeed. Oh, and I also very much value being a man of my word, so I also intend to do this in a way that is no way tried to sneakily infringe on the incredible work of Mojang team is doing, and that Microsoft is successfully doing the Microsoft's shitification about, and I respect them for doing that. It's their job, and they, from what I understand, let the studio do things their way, which seems very fair to me. Which again, he's probably just saying, yeah, I'm going to try very hard not to get sued by Microsoft, which he may regardless. There is an interesting question, certainly, and we can just mention the Minecraft movie and then quickly move on. What is the spiritual successor of Minecraft? Is it another blocky voxel-based crafting world where you're mining and crafting? Or is it a world that is procedurally generated but has a whole new level of graphics that in no way could have been rendered when Minecraft originally came out? Is it going to be in the light fantasy genre that Minecraft is? Or is it going to go in a completely different genre like sci-fi or something like that? This is not a project I would imagine is going to be easy for Mojang, really, in that you really can't go 2D and make a Terraria clone. It's already been done. If you go hyper realistic, it's going to compete with a lot of games that already have those survival based mechanics. But there is some possibility there that you can make a hyper realistic 3D survival game and it actually catch on, because Fortnite kind of did that and then forgot about it and just became a battle royale game, and there really hasn't been any other major successful survival crafting type games. You know, where I think Notch probably would be best situated is to focus on the original concepts and the original conceit of an open world procedurally generated game that can just go on forever, because that's where Minecraft got its original success and grew from there. There are plenty of games like Starfield from Bethesda that also have tried to do things like that and failed. So if he can make something like Starfield, where you're going to entire different planets and there's something interesting on those different planets, that would be interesting if he can bring enough fandom to that and make that actually work. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if a Minecraft 2 spiritual successor to Minecraft, not actually called Minecraft 2, is literally just completely devoid of ores and mining and redstone and fighting zombies and fighting the ender dragons and withers and shearing sheep, and probably will have dogs and cats and things like that. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it's fairly different. You could take something like Minecraft and just take it to the next level. There is a simplified system certainly happening there where you're punching trees to chop trees down. If all of a sudden you had to have a whole mini game to chop trees down correctly with the right technique, it probably would just make the game more of a chore to do it that. If you're smelting iron the real world way instead of just putting it in a smelter and getting an iron brick out the other side, I mean, that would probably not make the game any better. So making something more realistic just to make it more realistic isn't going to be the right move. On the other hand, it could be a game that is extremely similar to Minecraft, but just has better co-op, although co-op's not bad in Minecraft anyways. But yeah. It'll be interesting to see if Notch does something worth mentioning when there's so many pitfalls of him A, not turning out a game at all, or B, turning out something that is just not particularly that interesting. That being said, as I wrap up this rant, I guess I kind of have to applaud Notch just relaxing and taking 10 years off. It's certainly nice when the 1% of 1% of super rich people can just sit on money and do nothing and take 10 years of their life as a vacation. That's certainly not something most people can do. But yeah, compare him to Todd Howard, compare him to the Fable creator. There definitely have been other major figureheads. The Gears of War creator is another example. The Bioshock creator. Most of these I can't even remember their names. But yeah, a lot of those creators have actively gone out of their way to stay in the forefront of news and media and get press coverage and talk about new games and announce new games and really promote themselves as much as promoting new games. And so there is something, I think, better to just saying, hey, take a vacation. If you don't have an idea, if you're not actually going to make a game, if you're not actually contributing anything, just stay out of the limelight. Whereas Todd Howard has way too much press coverage around him, considering how few good Bethesda games have been released. So yeah, there's something to be applauded there too, as far as just being humble. One comparison, I guess I can also say, there's Cyan World, the makers of Myst, also kind of had that kind of humility, perhaps forced on them after their failed attempt to make an MMO, which maybe that would be where a spiritual successor to Minecraft would go, is it's just going to be one procedurally generated server world for all players, instead of having a player cap of any amount. That is something that you could certainly do to improve upon it, is that to have it be an MMO. But yeah, the makers of Myst also just kind of forced into dormancy, forced into silence, not really doing anything or saying anything for many, many years until they finally came out with Abduction and then the remake of Myst and most recently the remake of Riven. They also had some stumbles trying to be a publisher and releasing games that they didn't actually create as a publisher in their reboot, and certainly they've also had a stumble with trying to make a game that is not actually in the Myst universe, where that too failed. Abduction did alright, but their second game, non-Myst game to release, which I can't even remember the name of it, was not talked about or received particularly well at all. I suppose it is also worth pointing out, though, that we won't have any real game released from Notch anytime soon, unless he's been secretly developing a game for 10 years, which I'd almost suspect that in the back of his mind, every now and then, he probably was thinking about a new game and having thoughts about it, but he may not have been actively programming it, and having thoughts about how a game could go versus actively programming a game to work that way are two extremely different things. That brings us to the Gematsu articles, and we can see that I've already gone an hour and 44 minutes, so just with my macros not being broken and there actually being news, we have more things to talk about. Also, I think that probably helps to have started a little bit later. I'm still in this weird situation where I'm trying to figure out when my alarm clock should go off to wake me up, knowing that I'm going to turn over and go back to sleep after it goes off anyways. I also feel like I've probably gotten up to go to the bathroom when I'm asleep way too much. And obviously, you don't want the opposite of that, where you don't get up to go to the bathroom while you're asleep. But that probably is what makes me have a lot of bad sleep quality in general, is that if every 45 minutes you're getting up to go to the bathroom, and you just would never get into the REM cycle. So if anybody else out there is experiencing that, I'd say perhaps consult a doctor if you can, because yeah, if you are getting up way too often, you probably are interrupting your own sleep cycles very often, which I hadn't really thought of that, but yeah, there definitely are times where I'm getting up and going to the bathroom what feels like 5 to perhaps even a dozen times a night, and that's just like, that's way too much. But that doesn't have anything to do with video games. So Gametsu here, I have a lot of articles, so it feels like he's back to work as far as re-releasing press releases. Airframe Ultra public beta test is set for January 10th to the 13th. An offloading demo is going to follow the beta test after the beta test closes. Marvel Rivals is adding the Fantastic Four on January 10th. Mr. Fantastic, the Invisible Woman, Human Torch, and the Thing. I'm not sure if they've ever done a real story here where the Invisible Woman felt like an Invisible Woman, being like neglected by all of her male counterparts and her husband. I don't think they ever really write Mr. Fantastic and Sue Storm, which is, I believe, her actual name. In that way, I think they write them as more of a loving, happy family for the most part. I still very much am of the opinion, though, that they started with some generic skeletal models for almost all of the characters. There's probably big guy skeletal models and average guy skeletal models that just have very wide chests and comparatively very thin hips. And this is just not really who I expect when I think of Mr. Fantastic. Particularly the beard feels weird, but just like massive pectoral muscles and very wide chest and 6 packs going down to a very tiny hips. And same thing with Johnny Blaze here. Just I don't really like the outfits too, and the armor. It does feel like on this image maybe they've gone a little bit smaller on the breast size of the Invisible Woman, and weirdly her hips in this image are, well, still kind of small. They've also gone out of the way to draw this to the image to show more butt. Yeah, this is just not really what I expect from the Fantastic Four, and it does just feel to me like they've got some probably Asian animators making these models that aren't particularly familiar with the comics or just don't really care. And it seems to be fairly consistent in Marvel Rivals that that's the way it goes as far as character development goes. Of course, none of that really matters. I haven't heard anybody say anything too much new around Marvel Rivals, so I imagine it's still going to be played, but we may be starting to transition into a point where Marvel Rivals will just be in the number 4 spot, the number 3 spot as far as 24-hour concurrent player base, but there's just not going to be anything new to say until new characters are added or a new season is added. If it is even a seasonal game. But yeah, I think it is locked itself in. Now, it may not have 100% locked itself in as far as its level of player base and success, because kids maybe today are getting back into school. So we will keep an eye on it, certainly, to see if the player base and the numbers start to drop fairly significantly now that they're back in school. But I can't imagine that there's any other new games really that kids would be playing. This is a free-to-play game with the Marvel characters. That seems like that would work pretty well for kids. A game called Somber Echoes launches January 21st. What I want to keep here, as far as an eye, is to see if these games are popping up via the curation, and it doesn't seem like they are. What I'm going to want to do going forward, I just realized this, is when I curate a page, I also want to see if the follow list is already visible. Because if I'm already following something, then I don't want to make another YouTube short around it, and I probably don't want to really talk about it, particularly in the case of most of these games that it just won't have a release yet, or will be released but won't have a lot of reviews. So yeah, I'm gonna pull that to the side just to remind myself to curate it. Less pages being redundantly looked at would be helpful. That being said, right now there is also a case where this was a Steam link and it didn't get opened, so I need to investigate that too. The next Gematsu article is Freedom Wars Remastered, has a systems trailer. If you want to check that. This feels like the first time I've heard of Freedom Wars. But honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if it's a case where my mind has just kind of reset on everything. And that I've just kind of forgotten any other announcements pre-Christmas. That being said, I do suspect if this was announced, it would have had to have been done at least a month ago. Oh yeah, I do remember this. This was the weird game where they have some kind of numbers above their heads as far as how long I think that they should be imprisoned. So you're just born with this concept of you're guilty, and then they're forced to fight to reduce their prison sentence for being born guilty for, I don't know, the crime of being born. I don't know what the real concept here is. You can see that this guy has like chains on his legs. And yeah, the original trailer here was like showing a baby being born and having a number over his head. Not all of them have chains around their legs though. Yeah. So yeah, this is like another example of how video games just don't tend to have boring, generic stories, particularly Japanese video games. But yeah, they want some kind of eye catch, some kind of concept, something that you need more than a 2-hour movie to even establish, let alone move forward on. If I think about it, a lot of the movies that do have more complicated concepts have to really just throw you into it. And yeah, and really have to go very long. Severance is kind of a good example of a TV series. It has like at least 6 or 7 hours to even begin to establish the weirdness of its world. Whereas a Severance movie would have to, just wouldn't work. it would have to be way too long to explain weird concepts. Yeah. It is an interesting thought, certainly, as far as how could you make the Office equivalent of a video game. I'm sure game publishers and developers think that thought every now and then probably realize that there's no real answer, but yeah. A Friends style video game, or even a Seinfeld style video game, like none of that day life type story easily translates into video game mechanics. I mean, you certainly could make visual novels and tell stories that way, but that's not the kind of video games most people that could afford to make games and afford the license to The Office or Friends or Seinfeld would want to make. Even movie tie-in video games tended in the very old days to be completely disconnected from what they were covering, and movie tie-in video games were almost always based on like Back to the Future or Batman, more action-based or comic book feeling type experiences. So yeah, I don't think you can make an Office-based video game. I did see that there are perhaps an increasing number of chat interactive adult games where it's just a cell phone interface and you're just texting this fake AI girl back and forth. That almost gets down to being a real world commonplace experience, obviously with different effects and different outcomes than you're likely going to get, but unless you're extremely lucky. But yeah, that's still not just set in stone, set in a real world type experience. Moving on through the Gematsu articles, Bleach Rebirth of Souls has yet another character trailer. I couldn't even tell you how that was pronounced. This is yet another character. I think I know this character, but I'm not sure I really do. Saying he's an Espada, which would be one of the Waco Mundo characters, not one of the Quincy's that are in the 1,000-Year Blood arc. Oh yeah, now I remember him. He's a character from the original Bleach anime series, as far as where I would have seen him from years and years ago. So it's not super surprising that I don't recognize him and remember him. So yeah, they're digging deep into the history of the Bleach series to include as many of the characters as they can, which is the right thing to do, but perhaps is an example of something that could have been curated and left on the cutting room floor, as far as not needing to make a character trailer for every single character. I seriously doubt there's more than 4 or 5 fans of this character on the planet that would have really gotten hyped with his announcements being added. And this being a fighting game, doing character trailers only gets you so far. At the end of the day, the acceptance and interest around the fighting game is going to heavily come down to like rollback code, net code, and just how it controls and how the esports players and fighting game fans really embrace it, which I don't feel like the fighting game fans have a lot of momentum to embrace any kind of anime-based fighting game. They seem to stick fairly consistently to games that are fighting games first and have their own subset of characters that they're not particularly super hot on any of the other fighting games. None of the Dragon Ball games in per se are super popular compared to King of Fighters or Street Fighter or things like that have a longer history and have been tweaked and worked on for a lot longer. And when you think about Street Fighter in particular, those characters don't have a lot of backstory around them, and clearly they don't need a lot of backstory around them to be liked well enough as playable characters in fighting game tournaments. The Carmen Sandiego reboot launches March 4th. I remember this was announced. I don't think it's going to be much of a game though, because when we looked at this trailer before, it definitely feels like there's really only going to be 4 or 5 locations that Carmen Sandiego, now as the good girl, is going to go to, and at those locations I don't think that there's as much of a gameplay. It seems to me like it's going to be a bunch of little mini games. There you saw a little sneaking mini game and pickpocketing mini game, and it does seem like at some point you are going to be asked questions to identify culprits. So it's going to be somewhat inspired by the original gameplay, trying to figure out an actual suspect. But I think the minigames are definitely being put there to make it more entertaining and also to push people into thinking that future games like this are going to be less identifying culprits and finding clues and more just playing mini games. This is a Netflix game, so I wouldn't expect too much from it anyways. I think Netflix at this point completely owns Carmen Sandiego, or at least has a good contract around it. There is certainly something to be said about making Carmen Sandiego the good girl instead of making her the bad guy as she was in the previous games. There is a thought, certainly, and that was one of the thoughts as far as if you were going to make a Carmen Sandiego game, particularly as I was thinking about things you could do in the Godot engine. There's a way you could do that where it constantly updates now if you just integrate it into Wikipedia. And if you just put a warning at the front to say, this game scrapes Wikipedia to get the list of all the countries in the world, and frankly it probably would be better if there were just updates occasionally that scraped Wikipedia to say, here's the list of all the countries that are recognized by most other countries in the world. From that we went to each of those countries' Wikipedia page and we picked out their national flag, their national birds, things like that, things that are going to be generally non-controversial. Although inherently countries like Taiwan would probably just get eliminated completely because China doesn't agree that Taiwan exists, and countries like North Korea might get eliminated completely anyways just because of their issues. But yeah, the main complaint about previous Carmen Sandiego games, why they wouldn't be re-released ever, is because the facts around them are not accurate anymore. But yeah, you could certainly have it just automatically update for Wikipedia, and that's good enough. It may not be 100% accurate, as long as you're just looking for specific countries. and specific facts around countries. Arguably, most of those facts are not that important, but the years they were founded, their flags, things like that aren't the worst bits of information to teach kids. Overall, where they are, what continent they're on, is pretty set in stone. You don't have to talk about wars, obviously. You don't have to talk about current presidencies or leadership or government styles. You could talk about their currencies, which wouldn't be the worst thought. You could talk about their physical geography as far as, do they have major rivers going through them? Are they a coastal country? Things like that. In that bit of geography could be a small enough subset to make the game still work, because you basically have to memorize all those facts to be really good. Perhaps you could get it down to a point where it's pretty obvious where is the next location to go. If the next location you're supposed to go is like Japan, and the hint you got in the previous location was that it was an island nation, well, as long as you don't include any other island nations, so don't include like Australia or New Zealand, and then it would be very obvious that Japan, compared to, say, let's see, the United States is not an island nation, Mexico's not an island nation. So if your three options as to where to go next was United States, Mexico, and Japan, and your hint was it's an island nation, that could be very easy, and that's probably where the level of Carmen Sandiego should be, is that it should be fairly easy. But yeah, if you're going to make a where in time as Carmen Sandiego, you could again also scrap the Wikipedia historical events. Pretty easily scrape all that information to figure out your questions and answers. If you were going to do where in the United States is Carmen Sandiego, you could break that down pretty easily too. Just flag states. When did they become a state? Do they border a ocean, or are they landlocked? Things like that. Are they in the north, the south, the east, the west? Things like that. Major landmarks. Do they have a Disney World or Disneyland? But yeah, you don't have to get particularly too into the weeds there. That being said, everything I just suggested is just recreating the old game, so this reboot with the minigames may be better as a concept. Let's see, the Resident Evil 4 remake, has sales have topped 9 million, 1 million units sold since October of 2024, and to celebrate that, they had the artist do, once again, a new rendition, which is very busy as far as everything that's going on here. Yeah, just a lot of stuff in this picture. Overall, particularly the sales numbers too, I would say point out that this was a major success. You have semi-bad guys and Ada Wong and Kraus, I think was his name. But yeah, no major lack of sales due to anything changed or slightly being changed in Resident Evil 4, which does prove that, you know, putting a different outfit on Ashley and making her kind of less scantily clad as the damsel in distress wasn't a significant enough level of change or censorship to convince people not to buy the game. But yeah, inherently, if the game is good, I do think people will overlook changes, and so much has changed that it said and it sold itself as a remake. It wasn't just a remaster. Had it just been a remaster and then there was censorship, the sales might have struggled a little bit more. I think we're somewhere over 14 million copies have been sold for the original Resident Evil 4, but it is worth pointing out that the original Resident Evil 4 also has been sold for a very long time on many different platforms and re-released many times. It is also worth pointing out that there is a YouTuber called Kill Count, which is not so much one YouTuber, or maybe it started that way, but it definitely isn't that, and it has now become this growing team of people. And for this year, once a month, they have committed to doing a video game kill count, which is very different from the movie kill counts that they had done up until that point. If you're going to do a kill count in a movie like Final Destination, then that's just going to be the movie, and you're just counting the number of people being killed in that, which in itself is a somewhat morbid concept, but it's done in a silly kind of way, and so it doesn't come off as morbid as it might seem. But it also is kind of pointless, and there definitely was a point where I stopped watching kill counts because they were either covering movies that I hadn't even seen or didn't really care about. It is effectively a channel that is profiting off of the work of movie creators and now video game creators by just taking their most interesting clips of scenes of the movie and abridging it while contributing something, but not a huge amount of something, in that somebody is just popping on screen and verbally describing what would have happened in the movie during that kill scene. It definitely feels like a channel that in part was designed to get around being demonetized on YouTube, but also it's just a very standard YouTube channel where you're taking somebody else's content and very lightly commenting on it, but it does have a high level of polish on it too, and I have to be careful, certainly, as my long plays also often are too me just commenting on something somebody else created, and really that is just the way society is going to go, is that the society is going to be very reference based, and fair use needs to be expanded to accept that. But yeah, I would definitely say Kill Count as a channel is doing fair use, or doing what should be considered fair use. But yeah, there is something very boring about them just counting the kills. But then it also becomes a very different thing when you're covering video games, because once again, if you're doing a kill count on Final Destination, the number of kills is just going to be the number of kills, whereas the remake version of Resident Evil 1, which is what they did a kill count for a video game on, has two stories, whether you're playing as Claire or Chris, that has slightly different outcomes and different endings also, which will eventually, games with different endings will change the numbers. And there is really only one spot apparently in the Resident Evil 1 remake where you have infinitely spawning enemies, where all the other zombies in Resident Evil 1 are procedurally placed. But you're going to run into that being an issue Certainly, you couldn't do a kill count on Minecraft because it would just go on forever. There's infinitely spawning enemies. Unless you're just playing the games. And certainly it's going to be a lot more work to have, even in this first video, for them to have 2 people play Resident Evil 1 and count every single zombie they killed for really no reason. I mean, games themselves could give you a kill count, and a lot of them do at the end of the experience. Yep. And so it's interesting they're going in that direction. I think they probably can see some metrics that show that they're getting less and less viewers, and so going into video games is a attempt to increase their viewership. I could also see that they are running out of horror movies that they want to talk about or cover. They may very well be running into horror movies that are just not going to let them make videos without getting content ID'd like crazy too. Yeah, it definitely seems weird to be doing kill counts around video games, and inherently the whole channel feels like it is half celebrating, I guess now, video games and movies as much as it is just advertising movies and video games, which on one level that's not a problem if you're talking enthusiastically about and honestly about a game or a movie, and people are then inspired to play or view those movies and games. That's not really a bad thing. That's just at some point purchasing advice and reviewing on although I would say kill count is not reviewing anything. They don't give scores or numbers or even a thumbs up or thumbs down for a movie. In fact, they're overly positive about movies that probably don't deserve it. So I guess my challenge for people watching today, if there is such people, is go check out that Resident Evil 1 kill count video and see if you can sit through all of it, because it's probably a lot longer than your average kill count video, and see if you get anything from it, because I'd be interested in feedback as far as is there really a value there or not, or is it really just a case that a couple of employees of that YouTube channel have figured out a way to play video games and make footage from playing video games in a different way. Which, in fairness, the only other way kill count would have been able to monetize playing video games would be to just do your standard second channel with video game live streaming, or move over the Twitch type pattern. Anyways, moving on to the next schematic articles. We still got several of them to go through. A Detective Instinct, Farewell My Beloved, has added a Switch version. Which, yeah. I'd assume that this is one of these older looking visual novels. Although, I don't think it actually is old. Yeah. Definitely kind of an older style of animating characters, which there's something to be said about that. Let's see if we can see. Yeah, it's on Steam. Again, the Steam link was not opened though, so maybe I just disabled that. And, well, maybe it was opened actually in that case. Excuse me. HYBE space IM. I have no idea what that is. Apparently that's a company. It's going to publish Bonfire Studios Project Torch in Japan and Korea. It is going to Bonfire Studios Project Torch is going to be self-published in the West. So that feels like a kind of inside baseball bit of information that particularly isn't going to make a difference to me in the West. Project Torch aims to be a competitive and cooperative elements for a unique multiplayer experience. So, generic description there of a game. Mages has appointed Makoto Asada as president and CEO. The former president and CEO Kingo Honjo has retired. That's nice and all, but it would be somewhat helpful if we could see what Mages actually published. So let's see, games developed. Steins Gate reboot is a big one. Notice these images are not loading in. Memories off, Never 7, Rent a Girlfriend, Quintessential Quintuplets. Some of these games, perhaps, suffering from censorship on Steam in particular. Some of these games also feel like they are based off of animes that might be based off of Kurokawa, or one of the other Japanese anime groups that might have been acquired or changed their direction. There definitely is a chance of things changing. It's a little surprising that even the Corpse Party series manages to stay on Steam, but the animation style there is very RPG pixely, even though the themes around Corpse Party is definitely horror and death. But I guess, in fairness, Steam really cannot start banning games for being horrific and grotesque, because that would be a significant portion of all the games on Steam. Yeah, they seem to have published the Corpse Party, but series, that seems to be about the only other thing recently though they've published. Moving on, Tokyo Extreme Racer launches in early access on January 23rd. At this point, I think racing games come and go with very little of any coverage or importance to them. There is possibly something that Tokyo Racing might embrace that other racing games might not embrace, and that the wraps on cars and the skins on cars could be a little bit wilder and perhaps more interesting to look at. Although, when I see cars being wrapped in Japan, often I don't think they're actually even used for racing. They tend to have anime girls, often in fairly lewd positions, for something that is being displayed publicly. I have seen, in fairness, on the road, even in the United States though, cars with bumper stickers and things that are fairly inappropriate to be in public, that are, some of which are anime based, but the vast majority are more political based, or just crude in general. There is an argument to questioning where the public decency laws should be when cars can do almost anything and not get called out on it. But yeah, the freedom of speech aspect, I think, trumps public decency laws, and it probably is better to do it that way. It probably is just a case that if you have a 4-year-old that sees something inappropriate on another car, they're just going to have to learn that that's part of life and that they have to deal with it, and very possibly not repeat words or thoughts or images they've seen. That being said, there is almost certainly a line that people are not willing to cross to. Either full-on nudity, wraps on skins is probably not acceptable by any society. Just because it's gross and grotesque. Like, I don't think I'd ever put an anime girl on a car I had. If I was going to do something, it would be something I would want to put in a car that I could enjoy in my own private section of the car, not something that's visible on the outside. And even then, that's assuming I was only driving the car ever for myself, which is not 100% likely. So, I mean, it's just not the same. If I wanted an anime figure or an anime girl, I would put it in my own bedroom, where that's my own domain, that's my own decoration decision. I wouldn't put it outside on the wall of my house for other people to do that. Ironically, though, digitally, as far as Facebook and things like that, people don't have that same level of constraint. And depending on whether you've set up your Facebook to be seen only by your friends or by yourself only or by public, there's a big difference there. But yeah, and it's not just lewd stuff. Certainly people spew out all kinds of nonsense mental stuff publicly online that they would be more restrained to say in public in the real world. Of course, that has nothing to do with video games. So I am kind of just rambling here. We're going really long today, which is probably just getting back into the swing of things. And honestly, since I'm already was a little burnt out yesterday as far as cleaning and decluttering, I'm not even feeling a lot of pressure. More and more it feels like doing these Wednesdays, Mondays, and Friday streams, that is pretty much the day done. I am still running into an issue too, where since I'm waking up so late, there isn't a lot that can be done in the middle of the night. There isn't a lot I want to do in the middle of the night. I also have been watching a lot of streaming still. Some of the anime series like Fire Force and Assassination Classroom I haven't gotten back to. Instead, I'm watching a live action fantasy series called The Outpost, and we'll see how far that goes. Once again, I failed to check to see if the series ends on any kind of happy note, however, or if it just gets canceled abruptly. But yeah, I've been watching a lot of TV yesterday too, instead of just taking it easy, and frankly I needed it. Now I just need to get back in the swing of actually streaming and actually decluttering and cleaning the house. Anyways, this week's Japanese game releases: Freedom Wars Remastered, which I guess that means Freedom Wars as a game had already come out. The Fox's Way Home, and more. The only physical and digital game was Freedom Wars Remastered, so yeah. Clearly, this week, which would have been the end of the year, is not the year to release, not the time to release games. In particular, even the digital only list here is really, really small. And I wouldn't say any of these games jump out as being even AA or single A games. They feel fairly indie things. We are seeing a new category here labeled West, where this game is getting released to the West exclusively, assuming that it has already been released in the East. So I wonder if that's how we're going to see it on Gamatsu going forward, is that there will just be this new category of games that are being released in the West. And see, these aren't actual sales numbers, these are just affiliate links to buy eShop cards. So yeah, I really have to question when this Freedom Wars game originally was released. For there to be a remastered being released right now. See, this was a game I think we had already kind of covered, Valkyrie Squad Siegebreakers, with the somewhat lewd characters popping up every now and then, with it being a survivors game otherwise. Yeah, I definitely do feel like we're going to be at a point here where going forward I'm going to be particularly careful about showing any lewd imagery. I know one of the games on Steam seemed like it wasn't labeled correctly, and so I was seeing what looked like a very lightly censored nude character, and I don't want that kind of imagery even popping up in the live streams. The number one goal, as I said last stream, is to not get my channel deleted in 2025 by YouTube. So yeah, definitely am going to either manually curate everything or automatically curate things, or automatically curate things then manually curate things, which is also probably where it should be, is that I should just look at every single game to be presented after an automatic curation, and even if that does take a little bit more time, just to be certain. So that brings us to the Gaming on Linux articles, which I'm not 100% sure that it isn't just opening all of these articles. Over the next few streams we'll see if my macro, now that it's back into a more stable position, can be tweaked to be more accurate in what it's actually popping up, instead of popping up redundant stories. But yeah, CES is happening right about now, so Intel says they're very committed to their discrete graphics cards. The Core Ultra 200HX and H series CPUs have been announced also. On these cases, I will say there's too much technical details to go into for video games. We might be seeing new models of Intel CPUs that actually make some sense, but I'm not sure. We might see announcements for new GPUs that make some sense from Intel. I'm not sure either. So what I am going to do is just cover the headlines on these, and we'll let CES happen, and we'll see what the big winners and what the big announcements were. I'll have more information by watching YouTube videos of more technical people as they try to explain it to me. There was a brief time I also saw on Slick Deals that the 9800 3DX AMD CPUs, which is their newest and best CPU, I would imagine, that people were very hyped on, seemed like they were back in stock at a reasonable price once again. So there is still very much an argument that the AMD 9800X, which I hope that's the right number, is the CPU to get, the 3D version. No, the newest AMDs that have just been announced have AI in their name, and yeah, I don't know if CPUs really need to have AI technology as a sales point or even being integrated. There is a question certainly in my mind if maybe voice recognition actually doesn't work on modern CPUs. I think it probably would, though. I don't think you need a specialized chip to do voice recognition. So I don't think speech recognition and voice interaction is what AI is being branded as these days, although that still is an earlier version of large language models. So in the technical terms, it is about the same thing. But no. Yeah, there is a question in my mind if all speech recognition on a cell phone isn't just being sent to a server and then sent back via the internet. And I guess the question there would be to put it in airplane mode and see if it works still. But I know that at least one of the Home Assistant's devices has a local voice assistant technology into it, but it is its own hardware, and that might be custom hardware. Of course, that has nothing to do with video games. I'm getting off topic. SteamOS is apparently moving from the Steam Deck to more handhelds to give, which gives the hope for a better anti-cheat compatibility. I question why you would assume that, because those are two very disconnected things. Yeah, SteamOS being available on several other devices doesn't mean for a second that the game developers aren't going to actively block those devices or not program their anti-cheat to work with those devices. Apparently the GPT-Win 4, which is a whole bunch of GPT-Win devices, is planning to have SteamOS support. Lenovo Legion Go, I think, is going to have a SteamOS version. And yeah. So far, I don't think this article has any new news. And this is more of just an editorial, so even tag here, which I could see myself curating outside of editorials. Again, I would say I still think you should probably install Bakelite if you build a computer right now, instead of trying to jerry-rig SteamOS to run on a pre-built or custom-built PC. I think you'll just have better support and better updates in that case. SteamOS feels like it's updating or targeting updates once a month, whereas Bakelite Linux is basically updating on the daily if you want to. Yeah. The scenario of SteamOS being right now only at 2%, of the scenario of that succeeding greatly would be a very weird one. You basically would have to have an incredibly dry spell of Microsoft admitting they're not coming out with a new console, PlayStation admitting they're not coming out with a console, and Nintendo releasing a total flop, which might be a thing. But then also you would still need to see a major dry spell on cell phones, and you would need to see enthusiasm and money available to buy some kind of SteamOS device. That kind of enthusiasm can grow, and we hope it grows, but I just don't think it's going to skyrocket overnight. I just don't think there's a single way to convince that many people to buy SteamOSs. That the biggest way, I suppose, is if like Walmart removed all video games from their shelves and had a Steam Deck, SteamOS, Steam Machine type device on their shelves instead, and that was the only option for all the Walmart shoppers. That would be the most influential thing there. Unless the price was just right. If all of a sudden a Steam Machine comes out and it's better than a Switch 2 and $100 cheaper than the Switch 2, that might work. But yeah, I don't imagine any of those scenarios would really happen. We might, I guess if the Switch 2 was announced and it was $600, that would be shocking, certainly, and that might change things, but still probably not enough. if Nintendo all of a sudden put all of their games on PC, that would change things drastically. If Nintendo canceled consoles and stopped making consoles, that would be a big change. But you're really getting into the wild concepts and paths for any major growth. The reality of it is, if the Steam OS is going to succeed, it's just going to have to slowly grow. Now, if Steam OS can replace Windows, and all of a sudden a significant number of people are buying new computers with Steam OS instead of Windows on, then we might see the numbers jump up fairly quickly there. I don't think a lot of people are going to go out of their way, though, to install Steam OS instead of Windows 11, or would even know how to do that. There's only so much Steam can do to make installing an operating system safe and easy and not scary, which is the vast majority of people are not going to be willing to install a new operating system. Moving on, the Vox Libre free and open source Minecraft-like is at version 0.88, bringing huge improvements. This is perhaps an example of also what Notch can't do to make a Minecraft 2, is that you can't just have a free and open source version of a Minecraft clone, which really does make an argument that it's got to be in some kind of completely different world without trees or dirt, and probably just a sci-fi game would make a lot of sense. Or it could have trees and dirt, but it's got to look very different. Kira Quest 64 looks like a classic Nintendo 64 PS1 game, and it's coming to Linux and Steam Deck. Interesting. I would say the curation here as far as Steam links are not being clicked on at all, and that's probably something I did intentionally. I do know that there was a problem at one point where it was clicking Steam links at the wrong time, or it was clicking Steam like down here, which would just bring the category of Steam up, although that tag is actually Steam Deck. This is the same article too, so we've got some duplicates that popped up somehow. Let's see, Project Zomboid Build 42 Unstable is out with lots new for testing. If you want to try unstable versions of games, which I don't know why you would want to do that. Here we have this game has been out since 2013 and it's still in early access. That is crazy. 12 years. It definitely is a case to say that games should not be allowed to be open early access for 12 years. It should have been out of early access as version 1.0 after like 4 years. And in fairness, Valve is somewhat taking a few small steps to cracking down on that kind of nonsense. Unfortunately, it really is also a case that a lot of gamers don't seem to mind that some games are just constantly in early access, because early access may mean something very different to one game than it does another. Let's see, Discord's Canary version on Linux breaks of the Wayland screen support for now, which Canary versions are unstable versions of software, so it's not the version you would really want to be using if you're actually using Discord instead of just testing newest versions for programming reasons. The GPD Win 4 handheld plans to support Valve's SteamOS in 2025, which is to say they can make a lot of promises until it's actually released. Yes, this feels very, very Vita-like as far as the device, but it might run into kind of the problem with a lot of these GPD Win devices and a lot of these devices in general, in that it may be somewhat underpowered or it may be way too expensive. It's 6-inch screen, but it's running at 1080p, which is a higher resolution than the Steam Deck runs at, which will be interesting. I kind of like the idea of a flip-up keyboard. Clearly there are no touchpads here, but I haven't really heard anyone sing major praises for GPD Win lately. Although a lot of the criticisms around these types of devices, as far as portable devices that previously would run Windows, is the Windows part. So all of a sudden now these Chinese manufacturers of these types of devices may very well find just massive improvements with SteamOS. That being said, it is also kind of worth pointing out that SteamOS right now is still mostly big picture mode, with just a lot of button mapping while you're in big picture mode, and they've not done as much as I would have liked to see them do with the desktop mode. And so yeah, it'll be interesting to see if somebody embraces this. But it would have to be basically 2 or 3 years before I would start recommending buying any of these devices over the Steam Deck. Just for screen size alone, I think this one falls out. I would say that the screen size even on the Steam Deck feels smaller than I would like it to be. I would much prefer the screen flip up and be twice as tall for dual monitors than have it have a thumb pad keyboard. I just don't think you need the thumb pad keyboard that much to do something like that. And certainly this is going to be too small to modify or add anything into, so you might very quickly lose connectors, which there's very few of those on the Steam Deck anyways, and lose buttons as far as volume up and volume down. You may not be able to change the internal storage. So there may be long-term better reasons to stick with the Steam Deck anyways. And I don't know if this is an OLED screen, which that would be the other question. Yeah, it's not really saying anything like that. Yeah. It's starting at $851 too, so it's also massively expensive for it being smaller size, which, yeah, that price alone makes it not really viable for most people. There is no AMD Z2 Steam Deck model coming, says Valve, with CES starting tomorrow. I think it's already started today. There's already a lot of leaks and speculation going around Valve having to shoot down the AMD Z2 Steam Deck. Also, plenty of rumors and speculation of perhaps Half-Life 3. AMD is expected to reveal the AMD Z2 processors today. And arguably, though, I don't think there actually is going to be a product labeled AMD Z2. So this may very well be Valve saying there's nothing by that name, because there is nothing, there's no Z2, but they're being fairly straightforward on it instead of being coy, which is a direct contrast to the other article where the game developer just said wait and see if Mass Effect 5 has a Paragon system or not, or a morality system or not. Yeah, I think Valve definitely wants to shoot down as many rumors as they can as fast as possible because they just want to keep the focus on things that are actually coming out, or keep the focus on what has already been released. And then this is an older story, but we'll cover it again. PAL has set PAL World back on Steam Deck to playable, but listing multiple issues. There was a brief day or two there where PAL World was labeled as unplayable via the Proton compatibility labels after its most recent update, which does make it feel like Valve is just going to be running more checks and being more careful about what it labels as playable, because there has been in the past accusations that the Proton DB labels or Valve's Proton compatibility labels, which I don't think actually are connected to Proton DB. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But there have been complaints in the past where they've been fairly inconsistent. And then Soleco won IndieDB's 2024 Indie of the Year award, plus a big sales milestone was hit. Okay, so that's just kind of promoting a game. I still am coming back in my mind to the Godot highlight reel, which I did install that plugin, the Godot blocks that looks like Scratch, and honestly there just aren't that many blocks at the moment. It is very early days if you were going to try and do drag and drop blocks in Scratch programming, and honestly I just don't think you should. I just don't think it's an extension. Godot's GD script in Godot is so simple already. Just watch a YouTube tutorial and you can be down the path of figuring it out just using typing. But yeah, the actual game's highlighted instead of the assets that have been added. Still just aren't varied enough. I do feel like there might be a slight danger that there's just too many tutorials, too much emphasis on making 2D games, not quite enough emphasis on making 3D games, and just generally not enough emphasis on making varied games. So it does feel like a lot of tutorials are, here's how you make a Survivor's clone, or here's how you make Pong, or here's how you make tic-tac-toe, or here's how you make something that does a small feature of Baleotro but doesn't really get into the detailed coding that you would have to do to get Baleotro to actually work, which none of the tutorials are going to go into that detailed coding likely, as far as, alright, you've made a game that looks good, but now you need to put in some custom code, otherwise you're going to just be making the exact same thing that other people are making. And so there is a definite sameness on what is being released this year, and I'm hoping to see more variety next year and in the future in general. Now, GameDeveloper.com still didn't work on my macro, and I don't know if that's because it doesn't actually work, or if that's just a case of it didn't think there was any new stories. So I just manually went through here and clicked on a couple, which may be redundant. Yeah, Black Myth Wukong being named Game of the Year in the Steam Awards is not particularly new news from Game Developer. Resident Evil 4 Remake topping 9 million in sales. Only 3 Resident Evil titles have ever sold more than 10 million copies. Which, yeah. Interesting. So have they already surpassed Resident Evil 4's original sales then? So you're saying Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil 2, and Resident Evil Village, which I think is 8. I've really dropped the ball on the Resident Evil series too, in that I really should purchase and play 7. Should have done it years ago, and we'll see if I ever get any free time this year to actually go back to making footage. yeah, it's gonna be a weirder situation overall as far as just when I decide I need to buy new games versus just playing older games. I still, as far as I can tell, I don't think any of my nieces and nephews got any Steam Decks or computers, so I still am not really at the point where family share works and there's this real desire to potentially start getting different types of games or newer games. So yeah, I've still got probably several years. They're all fairly young still. And so yeah, it's early to say on January 6th to say I don't imagine I'll actually be buying any games this year, but I honestly don't imagine I'll be buying many games, if any games, this year. Yeah, building even a new computer when I get around to it isn't going to inherently motivate me to buy new games. What would have to happen is I just have to run out of games I want to play that I haven't covered already. Moving on to GameDeveloper.com, Sonic the Movie Hedgehog franchise has topped $1 billion at the global box office. One thing I think they probably should take away from the Sonic movies is that almost any good written movie with a interesting character probably would succeed, because Sonic is not Mario, so I just don't think he's that big of a bringer. He definitely is a bringer as far as getting people interested in going and seeing the movie, and the newest generation of Sonic fans are completely different fans than older generation Sonic fans, and so I do think that that age group probably do want to see the Sonic movies. But honestly, if there was, say, a Donkey Kong movie, I think it would do just as good as a Sonic movie, as long as it's a good movie, as long as it's animated slightly nicely. The Detective Pikachu movie I thought did fairly well, and I think they may be making a sequel to that. I'm surprised that the 2D animated Pokemon movies don't come out in theaters and succeed better these days. There is perhaps a 3D CGI element to this, and that maybe kids just don't want to watch 2D animation anymore. It'll be interesting to see what that Bluey movie is like when it comes out. Not the sign, but they're making a new movie. I also heard that the Bluey producer is just going to be done after the movie, which they probably will just put somebody else in charge of it, I would imagine. I bet Bluey isn't just ending at that point. But yeah, maybe it is a case where there just should be a CGI movie, and Disney should be making CGI cartoony versions of movies, although their failures on that aspect have been very notable. Like, nobody really likes any of the Disney CGI movies, but perhaps that's because there's just not been a real expectation set with Sonic. There really haven't been any 2D Sonic movies. There's just been a couple of cartoons from many years ago. So yeah, I don't know. Sonic probably is a bit of a bigger attraction than a Lion King in CGI remake, which I guess kids probably just don't care about the Lion King, which arguably Disney failed to make kids care about games like the Lion King by not having any games around the Lion King other than Kingdom Hearts, which is definitely a mistake there. Disney should have a video games division that is extremely active. They should have been first in that market. They should have been converting every single movie they have the rights to a video game instead of just licensing it out. And they did have a video game section at one point, and they just gave up on it and failed. pretty terribly with Disney Destiny, I believe was the name of the series, the name of the game. Perhaps once again because they are specifically trying to put all of their Disney characters in one game instead of having multiple games. It is worth mentioning that there is literally, I believe, a new Disney game that once again was released that has just been put out there with no announcements at all. I believe it's maybe called Disney Collect. No, that's an old game. But yeah, I totally saw an ad for it. Maybe it actually isn't new, but yeah, it did just seem. Saw an ad for it, and I'm just like, how can you release a whole new game and not put any effort into letting people know about it? That being said, maybe on Disney Plus there are just tons of advertisements already for it, and I'm just not watching Disney Plus, so that may be part of Disney's whole plan. Of course, these streaming services have irritated enough people that they are now potentially starting to cut the cord once again and go back to whatever they were doing before as far as streaming services. Well, we're 3 hours in already. I'm getting too distracted at this point, so let's hurry up here. I even have a little bit more work to do after we go through all the new games because I ran the macro before on Saturday, so I have a couple other games to look at. Meta has stopped selling the Quest Pro headsets after a 2-year run. Apple also has stopped selling their augmented reality. I'm not sure that was confirmed. That may have just been a rumor, but I do believe it. WWE 2K23 gets its final takedown after 2K discontinues online service. Which, yeah, that sucks, certainly. That happened right around the end of the year. I wouldn't be surprised if it did. Then Xbox Cloud Gaming is heading to LG Smart TVs with a pre-installed app. And I imagine that is going to be promoted at CES quite a bit. Yeah. Again, when I was rambling about the idea, it's kind of crazy that Cortana just can't control system settings. They're not even calling it Cortana anymore, but they're calling it, I think, Copilot. But when you start to put Xbox on cell phones and TVs and tablets and things like that that aren't going to potentially have easy to use interfaces, having online Copilot voice activation to turn the TV volume or mute the TV or something like that would be somewhat helpful. Although particularly on TVs, it would be very helpful if you could say put the TV in game mode or turn up the brightness on the TV, so you don't have to go through LG's menus to adjust things. I doubt that would ever work, but it would be nice. And they're still promoting a lot of, I think this is Sea of Thieves, this might be the other one, Skull and Bones, but yeah, they're still promoting the Microsoft pirate game, which everybody in Microsoft seems to be still in love with. whereas I don't know how many people outside of Microsoft actually care about it. Anyways, that's going to bring us to all the new games on Steam, and I'll try and go through these fairly quickly. So there was a game like this, where it was RPG Maker type display, which yeah, I complain about how all of the Godot games are kind of rigid and look the same. RPG Maker is a million times worse in that fact, in that you really can only make RPGs. Maybe you could make a visual novel in RPG Maker, but why even bother doing that when you could use visual novel game engine to do that instead? I would like to see 2025 be the end of games that look like RPG Maker games, even if they aren't actually made in RPG Maker. And this isn't even the newest visuals that you would get out of the newest version of RPG Maker. This is still the 8-bit visuals. Now, hidden object games, I can't really hate on them too much, as there seems to be some audience around that. But I would perhaps like to see a slight reduction in the numbers of hidden object games. Of course, asset flip games, I'd like to see the numbers significantly reduced. Clicker games, I'd like to see their numbers significantly reduced. Again, I feel like it is just a case where if you had certain tags just raising red flags, and if it were just a case that you cannot use Steam Direct, you have to submit through a more complicated human review process for certain tags in certain types of games, you could significantly reduce the ever-growing number of what are just garbage games being submitted to Steam. And see, that's what I found so disheartening around the video I watched, where it was 100 game developers passing it on, is that I think in their hearts of hearts they think that the games they make are particularly good, which I don't like that thought at all. I have to say, if the asset flip garbage game makers that make a game like this, for instance, if these people really think they are good developers, if they're that deluded, well, it just shows that there's not a shared reality, and it's really sad. I would much rather live in a cynical world where these kinds of garbage game developers know it's garbage, but they figure they'll put it on Steam for $100 and sell it for 69 cents and hope to get enough units sold, or they're money laundering or doing something else. Suppose there could even be, depending on what country you live in and or what state in the United States, there might be some kind of governmental assistance. Is another game with asset flip zombies and bikinis. Yeah, I suppose if you were getting like food stamps or something in a country and you had to prove that you were actually working, putting out a video game might prove that you're working as a self-employed game developer. Seems like a lot of work for something you could do some other way. But yeah, again, I would rather live in that cynicalness and than live in a world where people are just deluded. And sadly, it's probably a little bit of both. That there definitely are some people that make garbage games that are deluded. There definitely are 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds that think they're good at game development, and in 2025 can now use things like Unity or Godot or Unreal to make something using pre-bought assets that is good enough to feed into that delusion.